I keep fighting voices in my mind that say I'm not enough.
Welcome to the second session in the series, which we've entitled The Road to Easter. As I have said previously, the road that leads to Easter doesn't begin in Gethsemane or even in Bethlehem. It begins way back in the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis. Indeed, God's plan for our salvation is the story of the Bible. And this series is intended to tell you what that story is and how you can follow it through all of the books of the Bible. In that first session, we spent some time focused on the whole Bible, and we set the scene for telling the story of salvation history, the story of the Bible. We left off that session at where God had just finished creating the world. He started out with nothing, and 6 days later, he had fashioned through his word, let there be, a virtual temple in which he would dwell with all that he had created. On the seventh day, he made a covenant with the world, binding himself to his creation for all time. Now, today, we turn to concentrate on the crown jewel of God's creation, the human race. We've all heard the story 1,000 times, but this time we're going to read it differently. We're going to read it as the start of salvation history, the start of God's relationship with the human family. God, we told, created man in his own image. In the image of God, male and female, he created them. But what does it mean to say that God created man in his own image? Well, it means that the human person is a child of God. And if we fast forward to the Gospel of Luke, we see that Adam is the son of God, Luke 3:38. And we see elsewhere in Genesis that the phrase image and likeness is also used to describe the birth of Seth, Adam's son. In the language of the Bible, to be born in someone's image or likeness means to be that person's child. So when God creates man in his image, he creates him to be his son. From the very beginning, God intended people to be his children, his divine offspring. So Adam is created as God's firstborn son. He's also conceived as a priest. A priest, by definition, is someone who performs religious rites, usually in a space used for religious activities. In our last session, we saw how the world was fashioned as a temple, and the Garden of Eden was depicted as the sanctuary of the temple, the holy place where God dwells. Well, you can't have a temple without having someone to guard it and keep it. And that's the task that God gives to Adam. It is a priestly task, but you need to know a little Hebrew to understand that. Adam is placed in the garden to work it and take care of it. It tells us in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15. But something important got lost in the translation of those words. The original Hebrew text, the words used are Obadiah and Shema, and these are words that are associated with priestly service. In fact, the only other place in the Bible where you will find these two words used together are in the book of Numbers, where they are translated as doing the work of the tabernacle. The Levites were in charge of protecting the sanctuary and the altar. But Adam similarly was given the duty of protecting, of caring for the garden. And all of this will become very important when we study Adam's disobedience and his fall from grace. For now, however, let's just note that Adam is described in Genesis as a firstborn priest. We also note that he's given the command to be fruitful and increase in number. Adam is to be the firstborn son of God and the father of a people. Since he's also a priest, it follows that his people are intended to be a priestly people. So what we have then in the Genesis account of the creation of mankind is God's original intent for the human race, which Peter, in commenting on our situation after the cross, describes us as a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. These words echo throughout the Old and the New Testaments. Israel will be called God's firstborn son and a priestly people. And when Jesus comes, he will be called the Son of God and the new Adam and the firstborn of many brethren and the high priest. And the church will be referred to as a priestly people, as we saw earlier. And we'll see all of this in detail in future sessions, but it starts here with Adam. So let's think a bit about this. How are we in this modern day supposed to read the account of Adam and Eve's fall from grace in Genesis 3? How are we supposed to do that? It's a bit like a fable with a sneaky snake, a gullible couple, some oddly named trees, and forbidden fruit. Remember, though, that the story in Genesis 3 is written in figurative language. It's more like poetry than journalism, more like a painting than a documentary film. Nevertheless, the story affirms some prime evil actual event that took place at the beginning of human history. It is, if you like, a Dreamtime story. We can't read Genesis 3 as if we're reading the newspaper, but by the same token, we can't read it like it's a myth or a fairy tale or a fable. It's as if it's about something that never happened. Biblical scholars say that Genesis is best understood as an example of the ancient literary style known as mashal, a riddle or a proverb, in which there are layers and layers of meaning. And when we read Genesis 3 closely, we find that the story turns on a number of tricky passages and words filled with multiple meanings: life, death, wisdom, trees, and so on. So I want us now to look at some of the characters in this account. And the first, of course, is the serpent. Who is the serpent? We're all used to the storybook Bible image of the long, thin snake hanging from the branches of an apple tree, but we might actually have to change our visual image of the scene. The Hebrew word used to describe the serpent, Nahash, implies something much more deadly. Throughout the Old Testament, Nahash is used to refer to powerful, even gigantic, evil creatures. Isaiah calls the Nahash a sea dragon, the great Leviathan. Job also uses the word Nahash to depict terrible sea monsters. And this is clearly the image in the book of Revelation, where it is described as an enormous dragon in the heavens, that great dragon, that ancient serpent who is called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. Revelation 12, verses 3 and verse 9. The church, of course, has always interpreted the serpent in Genesis 3 as Satan, the devil, in slithering form. So then, we know something that Adam probably didn't know, that this encounter with the serpent was a test against evil, a battle for the soul of mankind. And what Adam saw was a lot more than a little garden variety snake, so that we can begin to understand why he failed to fulfill his duties in guarding his wife and the Garden of Eden. To put it bluntly, Adam was scared to death, scared of dying. He saw the serpent as a threat to his life. We know that Adam understood what death was because God warned him that if he ate the fruit, he would die. And if Adam didn't know what death was, God's warning wouldn't make any sense, would it? Adam was scared that if he didn't do what the serpent wanted, this gigantic beast, he would be made to suffer and die. This story, this understanding of Adam's failure, may well be behind the words of Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14 and 15, where we read that by his death, that is by the death of Jesus, he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Of course, that doesn't mean that Adam didn't have any moral choice or responsibility in the matter. He chose to save his life, but he wound up losing it. He feared dying more than he feared disobeying the Father who loved him and who gave him paradise. And in this, he plunged the whole human race into slavery. The Bible and the church has also always taught that this was the sin of Adam, which is interesting given that the whole conversation with the serpent was apparently with Eve. And Adam didn't seem to come into play until afterwards, when it was mentioned that he was with her. But this last point is important. Adam was with her all along. In Hebrew, every time the serpent says the word you, he's speaking in a tense that we don't have in English, something like a second person plural. He's saying, in effect, you guys or you all. We could say that the serpent said something like, did God really say none of you must eat from the tree of the garden, meaning talking to a group or to a pair? So then, if Adam was at the scene the whole time, why didn't he speak up? Why didn't he take up the serpent's challenge? And that seems to be the point. In his fear for his own skin, Adam left his wife hanging. He left her to fend for herself. He was her husband. He was supposed to stand up for his wife. And as Ephesians 5:25 tells us, in that relationship, he was supposed to give himself up for her. That's what marital love is. Adam failed a test of his love, not only of his love for Eve, but also his love for God. God gave Adam the responsibility of guarding the garden sanctuary, the dwelling place of God and man. And in the confrontation with the serpent, he failed in his duties. He didn't protect the garden or his wife or himself. And the question now might be, so why did God test him like this? Well, because covenant love requires total self-giving. Self-sacrifice is essential to fulfilling the obligations of the human relationship with God. Remember what we said in the last session? A covenant means that God gives himself to his people, and the people in turn vow to give themselves to God. In the scriptures, each of the covenants require people to make a symbolic offering of themselves to God. There is no covenant without sacrifice of some sort. Sometimes the sacrifice comes in the form simply of total obedience. The sacrifice is a kind of token of their commitment to the covenant, their commitment to give all that they have and all that they are to God. Noah makes a sacrifice from each of the animals he took with him on the ark. Abraham is asked to sacrifice his only son Isaac. The Israelites in the time of Moses are required to sacrifice an unblemished lamb in the place of their firstborn. And in the time of David's son Solomon, sacrifices were offered daily in the temple. All of these were symbols of obedience. However, each of the covenants founded and was only partly successful. Why? Because of a failure of love, a failure of sacrifice. The people refused to give themselves completely. Noah, Abraham, and the rest all did great things, but they also did dumb and terribly wrong things. Abraham took a concubine. Noah became drunk. Moses lost his temper in the desert. Israel worshipped the golden calf. David committed adultery with Bathsheba. His son Solomon built a harem in addition to building the temple. Adam's failure is the beginning of this pattern. In fact, because the human race was so weakened by Adam's original sin, no one could give themselves completely to God. And because of Adam's sin, humanity lost its birthright, its divine inheritance, its membership in God's family. But before we move from Adam to Jesus, let's look at the riddle of the story. God tells Adam and Eve not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat of it, you will surely die, he warns in Genesis chapter 2 and 17. In the Hebrew text, there's a double death threat. Literally, it says, you shall die, or you shall die the death. Why the repetition of the word die? Can you be more dead than dead? Well, the serpent directly contradicts God. He tells Adam and Eve, you will certainly not die. He says too that they will be like the gods who know what is good and bad. And it's true that when they eat the fruit, they don't keel over and die. Instead, their eyes are opened, just like the serpent said that they would be. God even says, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. But Adam and Eve do die the moment they eat the fruit, spiritually. The truth in Satan's lie was this: Adam and Eve would not die a physical death once they ate the fruit. Adam and Eve lost something greater than natural life when they sinned. They lost supernatural life, the life of grace in their souls. They lost their relationship with God. Seduced into trying to be like God, but without God, they died the death. Yes, they chose the fruit freely. Like God, they exercised free will, but their freedom only led them into slavery. Their eyes were indeed opened, and they discovered their nakedness and were ashamed. We know that Satan has the power of death, as we saw earlier in the reference to Hebrews 2:14 and 15. Adam and Eve should have listened to God, whose warning seems to echo in these words of Jesus. And do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Matthew 10 and verse 28. But even as these children have exiled themselves from paradise through sin, God promises them redemption, a homecoming. He promised that throughout human history, there would be enmity between the serpent and the woman, between the offspring of Satan and the offspring of the woman. Early theologians called this the first gospel, proto-evangelium. God was promising here in the very first pages of Genesis, first pages of the Bible, a new Adam, an offspring of a woman who would undo the damage done by the first couple. Paul often called Jesus the last Adam or the new Adam. Jesus entered the world as the new Adam, conceived by the Spirit of God and born of a virgin mother. He comes as the one who does what Adam was supposed to do. He comes not to do his own will, not my will, but the will of the Father who sent him. He comes to serve and to offer his life as a ransom for many. And so Jesus enters a garden, and he experiences the curses of Adam, the dread of death, falling to the dirt, sweating blood from his face in his agony. He is crowned with thorns and stripped naked. He is led to a tree, the cross, which the early church saw as the symbol of the tree of life in the garden. Yet on the cross, he was obedient, saying to God in prayer, not as I will, but as you will. He does not grasp at equality with God as Adam did, but lays down his own life in sacrifice for the sake of the garden, the world, for his bride, the church. Finally, the resurrected Jesus appears in a garden, in the place where he had been crucified, to a woman, and is mistaken as a gardener, perhaps a reference to Adam's task to be the keeper of the Garden of Paradise. All of this is God's promise of good news right there at the beginning in the first gospel. But we have a long way to go before Jesus comes. In the next session, we will begin to see how this story unfolds in God's covenants with Noah and Abraham, and how we are continually directed in the plan of God's salvation after the disaster in the Garden of Eden. We have some points for you to discuss, but first, let us pray. Lord our God, you formed man from the clay of the earth. You breathed into him the spirit of life, but he turned from your face and sinned. Bring us back to you and to the life your Son won for us by his death on the cross. Amen. So here are our discussion questions. First, discuss the significance of the first man and woman being created in God's. Second, in 1 Samuel 15, 22 and 23, it is said that obedience is better than sacrifice. Discuss self-sacrifice as the ultimate form of obedience. How does this challenge you? God bless you and have a wonderful week. Amen.
I keep fighting voices in my mind that say I'm not enough. Every single lie that tells me I will never measure up. Am I more than just the sum of every high and every low? Remind me once again just who I am, because I need to know.